Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.
Jason Vangalis of Madison is a Democrat running in the 48th Assembly District. The primary is August 11th. Jason, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me. Thanks for doing this.
You have a career in economic development. Does that mean that's one of your top campaign issues, please?
Well, it is, yeah, and expanding economic opportunity and breaking down barriers, especially for those communities that have been underserved and underrepresented in the past. So really the rising of everyone's boat, so to speak.
Well, give us a very brief description of the 48th. Which part of Madison?
The north and east side of Madison.
North and east. Okay. Let's work through some specific issues. The governor has said that general fund tax collections because of the pandemic could fall by $2 billion with a B in the budget year that starts, well, today. If you're a member of the Assembly, that would give you some tough choices. Cut spending on major important programs or raise taxes or fees. Where would you come down on that, sir?
Well, I think you start with the prioritization of funding, and it starts by looking at what are those areas of the budget that will impact us from an economic recovery perspective the fastest. What will help us get back on our feet the fastest, and those are the resources that you begin to allocate and look at. I think it's a balance of both. We have to look at going forward what are the revenue streams that we can access. Beyond just what we typically have as well. So it's not a and or, it's a both kind of approach, I think, for me, Steve.
Okay, so but doesn't sound like you'd want to cut something like aid to K-12 schools or our healthcare program, right?
Right. First and foremost, you have to look at what from a health and safety perspective with COVID-19 still very much in play. How are we going to make sure that folks are safe and healthy? But at the same time, how are we going to get our economy back and rolling again? Okay,
new subject, reapportionment. The Constitution says the party in power will draw the next lines for boundaries for Congress, the Senate, and the Assembly. The governor says, how about a People's Commission that would draw lines and forward them to elected officials in the Capitol? Your position on that?
Nonpartisan redistricting is essential to our democracy. I think the Government Accountability Board in its previous role would have provided a good vehicle for this. Not having that institution, I think the next best step would be some kind of independent commission that's certainly bipartisan or nonpartisan, ideally, that can provide this kind of advice and guidance to our state legislature.
An issue that comes up every session I've covered pretty much for the last 10, 12 years, recreational marijuana. Where are you on medical and recreational marijuana, please, Jason?
Well, I have a very sort of specific attachment, I think, to addiction in the state of Wisconsin. My three older siblings struggled with it, been in and out of the criminal justice system. So I think it starts with the decriminalization of addiction, and part of that is the decriminalization of marijuana. I think that this provides an incredible revenue opportunity for the state of Wisconsin, so the legalization or re-regulation of it, I think would be certainly something to look at as the state looks for new revenue streams and economic impact of this industry generally.
Thank you. Americans know a lot more about how some police officers treat those in custody than we did 2 months ago. I guess my question is, do we need statewide standards for how police treat those in custody? Do we need to ban chokeholds as statewide policy, ban no-knock warrants, keep a database of officers most prone to violence? Please.
I think there's a lot that can be done, and when we look at our public safety infrastructure, the first is realigning our values around it. We need to start treating the source of some of the challenges in our communities around mental health, community social services, those kinds of things. And then I think the state needs to really provide a lot more control for local communities to control how they manage their policing and the types of programs and policies that they want to implement, and empower our local communities to do that. And then I think we do need to set some statewide standards of what do we value as human decency and appropriate behavior of our police and the conduct around that. And what that looks like, I think, is part of a broader discussion within our communities and that are most impacted, especially our Black and Brown communities.
What message did you take away as a candidate from the recent protests that tragically led to violence and the assault of a state senator here recently in downtown Madison?
That things have certainly reached a boiling point, and that voices are not being heard. And even though we've seen protests in Madison pretty consistently the last 2 to 3 weeks, those voices still aren't being heard, and progress isn't being met on what they need. I think that putting the harm of a senator, openly gay senator no less, I think in one who's been an ally to this particular movement is crossing a line that I'm not comfortable with. But I think at the same time, the level of frustration is certainly seen and felt.
Thank you. As someone who works in economic development, you're well aware of the property taxes and the role they play and what gets built and what doesn't. So Wisconsin, as you know, is some of the highest property taxes in the nation, which is why school districts and local governments are up against revenue caps and limits. Of course, they can exceed those limits through referendums. If you're a member of the Assembly, would you vote to keep property tax caps or get caps or limits or get rid of them, sir?
I think the property tax as a whole, we need to look at how we tax in the state of Wisconsin. We're consistently ranked as one of the highest income tax states in the country. In my time in economic development, I've been on the other side of the table helping businesses decide where they should locate and relocate. And consistently, that's a point of concern for a lot of businesses looking at the state of Wisconsin is what does the tax environment look like? Thankfully, we have a well-funded pension system, and that has certainly helped keep a stability perspective. But Steve, I think you can't talk about property taxes without talking about affordable housing and what we're going to do about that as well. I think that we need to look at how we can balance long-term housing, especially in this district here, where you've got a lot of workforce housing. It's a $175,000 house, really worth the $3,000 to $4,000 property tax price tag that folks are paying on it. And as folks age in place, it's getting harder and harder for them to pay for it. So I think we need to look seriously at, beyond the property tax system itself, how can we be more efficient in how we tax?
Well, when you say look beyond the current property tax system, is it time to look to alternative revenue sources? And one of them might be broadening the sales tax, our 5% state sales tax, to now exempt products and services. Do you see that as one potential option to reduce the reliance by local schools and local governments on the property tax?
I think one option that you mentioned, Steve, about taxing services is a significant opportunity for a lot of states, really, especially when you look at consulting services and those kinds of things that generally don't take place in this particular state. Those services generally go untaxed, and that's a huge opportunity for cities like Madison and cities like Milwaukee, as there's a tremendous amount of professional services that are provided in those particular places that we could look at revenue stream captures from those.
Let's talk about transportation. We've had for years a debate over how to stabilize highway funding. We haven't raised our 30.9-cent gas tax in a year. Do you think the gas tax should be raised to stabilize highway funding? What about the mix of urban transit? Can you give me your view on transportation funding?
Yeah, I think that this is another challenge for us, right? Public transportation provides a significant opportunity in our urban populations to be able to get to work. It's a significant piece of infrastructure for any good economic development plan. From a highway funding perspective, I think the gas tax is pretty standard fare in terms of revenue streams. The challenge there is does it indirectly affect poorer populations? And I think you might find that it does to some extent. I think looking at something more along the lines of carbon permitting and how we might look at use tax for use versus just a general flat tax.
Well, thank you. 2 questions on COVID-19, which hits the economy and the healthcare providers the state relies on. Recessions cause less revenue for the state, more demands for safety net programs like Medicaid. If you're a member of the Assembly voting on the next budget, should hospitals be an even greater priority in light of the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think the big piece about the COVID-19 planning and replanning is making sure that we're prepared for the next pandemic, and part of that is the supply chain of our healthcare system. So, while our healthcare infrastructure, like hospitals, are certainly essential and important, I think what we found was that we didn't have enough ventilators on hand or enough materials on hand to be able to support the pandemic in the way that we really needed to. So that, to me, is the more essential piece of it, is the planning and preparation for it, which includes that supply chain piece of it, Steve.
And then one follow-up question on COVID. should businesses that follow all prescribed COVID-19 practices, whether it's from WEDC or the CDC, should they be immune from frivolous lawsuits?
The last 3 to 4 months, Steve, I've been working on a multi-state coronavirus response plan for my company. We span 12 different states and over 30 different communities, and this is something that's inconsistent across the board in how we as a company plan for that. I think what's important is that we prioritize the health and safety of our employees and our workers to make sure that they can get back to work safely. But at the same time, we need to also understand that businesses need to make a decision, and they're making those decisions based off of risk. And so we do need to provide some level of protections for our businesses that are taking the precautions that are necessary so that we can get our economy back.
So they should get some type of legal immunity, Jason?
There should be some level of protections against, I think you used the word frivolous, Steve. So I think that makes sense to me.
Thank you. A study found that in 2015, out-of-state contractors were awarded $72 million in contracts for public works projects by local governments. That $72 million doubled to $146 million in 2018. The question is, should bidding standards and requirements give preferences to Wisconsin companies when local governments authorize major public works projects?
I think this is a great opportunity for Wisconsin businesses and Wisconsin employees. The thing that I would be interested in, though, is how many of those Wisconsin employers that are bidding on these projects are using labor that's from the state of Wisconsin as well. So I think if we do prioritize bidding of Wisconsin companies, which I think is a good policy, and we need to make sure that Wisconsin workers are also among those companies.
Well, I want to go back to what you said in the answer to the opening question and important issues. What's the next step to take and raise the income of middle class brown and black residents of the 48th district?
I think that starts with the diversity of economy, right? So the last 10 years I've spent working in community and economic development, both here in Wisconsin and around the country. I've helped create nearly 3,000 new jobs and bring nearly $10 billion in investment to those communities. And what we've learned is that in that time is that we can build a diverse economy based on the jobs. And when we look at the sort of stratification of jobs and concentration of jobs in this district right now, most of those jobs are accommodation, retail, and food service, which doesn't provide a significant amount of wealth building. What we can do is we can say, let's look at that economy, which is about $16 billion, capture the amount of money that we're exporting out of that, which is about $12 billion, and bring that supply chain in-house and close ranks on it. Build the types of jobs up and the diversity that we have, but we can't do that without strengthening our workforce. So we can build work-ready programs. I worked in communities in Colorado that helped build credentialing and industry badging into their curriculum in K-12, and their students were graduating with $20 to $25 an hour jobs without any kind of investment in any higher education. So I think that's something that where we start with, diversifying our economy and then building workforce trainings and student opportunities that support the economy.
Jason, when I interview candidates for the Senate and the Assembly from Madison, many of them are taking a position on the addition of a next generation of F-35A jets to Truax Field. Have you taken a position on that?
I think the economic impact is certainly there. It makes sense. What I'm curious about, and I think we have to wait to see how the chips fall on this one, is the property impact, the property tax impact of the folks that are living in that. So I'm optimistic that it won't be seriously impacted, but I don't have an opinion one way or another, because I think that importantly we need to understand what's the impact to personal property and growth in those particular fly zones.
Okay, 2 final questions. Is there any other major issue that's important to your campaign that I haven't asked about? I want to give you a chance to talk about it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I briefly mentioned, the opioid epidemic and the impact that it has on my family. That's a deeply personal issue. I think that goes with criminal justice reform and looking at how we respond to that. And then also affordable health care. I think that there's a lot that we can do, from looking at how healthcare organizations negotiate prices with our insurance companies, along with physician groups, and how they organize around that. I think there's a lot that we can do as a state to impact that, along with more preventative focused care and incentives and motivation for populations to really get around kind of better exercise, better eating, and that kind of thing.
And then last question, it's an open seat. Do you want to talk about differences with you and your opponents on August 11th and why you're most qualified?
Well, all of the issues that we talked about today, economic recovery, economic development, responding to COVID, are all things that I've done. Either the last 3 to 4 months working with FEMA and CISA on developing a multi-state coronavirus response plan for my company, or the last 10 years I've spent working in community and economic development. I've developed strategies for communities, worked with elected officials at all levels of government. I've seen the effects of what good planning can do in a community around workforce development, good policy around economic development incentives, how we attract talent and to stay in the state and get them to move here from other places in the country. I've done it here in Wisconsin. I've done it around the country. I can do it again here in Madison. And I think what puts me apart from those is that I have really a track record of developing jobs and creating good economic policy, which is exactly what the state of Wisconsin needs right now.
Jason Vangalis of Madison is a Democratic candidate in the 48th Assembly District. The primary is August 11th. Jason, thanks so much for talking to WisconsinEye.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Great day.
Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.